California task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Report. Content warning. It contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. Contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence.
Anti-Black narratives in arts and culture. The federal government has produced and promoted anti-Black narratives through a series of racist and white supremacist cultural projects across time, beginning with minstrelsy. Minstrelsy was a performance of blackness by white Americans in exaggerated costumes and black makeup. Known as blackface, 120 white Americans distorted the hair and facial features of African Americans and demeaned their language, accents, mannerisms. After 121, the first minstrel shows were performed in the 1830s in New York by white people with blackened faces and torn clothing. 122 These performances depicted African Americans as lazy, ignorant, superstitious, hypersexual, and criminal. 123. 30. Thomas Dartmouth Rice created the popular blackface character, Jim Crow. 124 By 1845, the minstrel show led to the creation of a whole entertainment industry that thrived on prejudicial stereotypes against African Americans. 125 Blackface minstrelsy grew after the end of the Civil War alongside racial hatred. Segregation laws that proliferated across the country after the end of the war took their name from this primary. In minstrel shows, 126 minstrel performances eventually expanded beyond the stage and entered radio and television airwaves. As well as movie theaters. 127 The minstrel performance became a cross-generational racial parody and stereotype made for white amusement. 128 The performance of minstrelsy relied on racist stereotypes that dehumanized African Americans. 129 This dehumanizing allowed white Americans to secure their own positive identity. 130 Minstrelsy repeated and entrenched this dehumanization into national and local American culture. 131 Watching and engaging in demeaning depictions of African Americans, like blackface performances, was even a common pastime for U.S. presidents. 132 Government-endorsed dehumanizing narratives of African Americans as violent and propagated white supremacist narratives of the Ku Klux Klan as saviors of the nation through the medium of cinema. The Birth of a Nation, which bore its origin title The Klansman, for its first month of screenings. Apologetically racist 1915 silent film directed by D.W. Griffith. 133 The film, which premiered in Los Angeles at Clunes Auditorium, takes place between the Civil War and Reconstruction. 134 Essentially a powerful propaganda tool, it glorifies the rise of the KKK, the white supremacist terrorist group. Depicts them as white saviors attempting to restore order to the nation. 135 Woodrow Wilson had the film shown at the White House, a federal government endorsement of white supremacy and anti-blackness. 136 Performance became a cross-generational racial parody and stereotype made for white amusement. The performance of minstrelsy relied on racist stereotypes that dehumanized African Americans. Dehumanizing allowed white Americans to secure their own positive identity. 104. Control over creative, cultural, and intellectual life. In the silent film era through the 1950s, the U.S. Department of Agriculture (USDA) was an important filmmaking agency in the federal government. 137 The films produced by the USDA reinforced problematic racial stereotypes against black communities. 138 USDA motion pictures supported separate but equal laws and customs. 139 War propaganda during World War II employed the strategic use of motion pictures as war propaganda. 140 This propaganda achieved two intertwined objectives: a false image of American democracy and the reinforcement of racist stereotypes about black people. 141 The Office of War Information Censorship Agency blocked racial depictions of discrimination against non-white people to falsely ideal racial democracy. 142 The Office of War Information also approved blackface and jokes perpetuating and relying upon black stereotypes. 143 And state governments have constructed racist monuments on state property and altered school curriculum, glorifying slavery and white supremacy, perpetuating the lost cause myth. Black History 144 state and local governments have collaborated with the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which seeks to memorialize and preserve Confederate culture. Generations 145 to memorialize the lost cause myth that the rebels were patriots and not traitors to the nation. 146 organized and systematic efforts to manipulate and distort the nation's history began immediately after the end of the Civil War. 147 these included erecting Confederate monuments, many of them placed on courthouse grounds, naming schools, streets, and military bases after Confederate officers, and lobbying Congress. 148 The construction of these monuments coincided with a historical period in which increased racial terror, lynching, and violence against Black people was at an all-time high. 149 See Chapter 3 on racial terror for more information. Monument construction has with moments in which Black communities seem to gain some political power or voice. 150 The Supreme Court ruling of Brown v. Board of Education, which declared segregation unconstitutional, and the civil rights movement triggered another wave of Confederate monuments across the country. 151 and state governments have enacted laws to protect Confederate monuments and other monuments to white supremacy. 152 Alabama, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia recently enacted these laws between 2012 to 2017. 153 in 2009. Supreme Court also protected government monuments from free speech challenges in Pleasant Grove City. Summum, a protection that includes Confederate monuments. 154 African Americans were denied access to the mainstream media for much of American history, due to segregation and racism. 155 Since the 2000s, many newspapers have apologized for blatantly racist news coverage that they have engaged in. A century-long period that encompasses the slavery era to today. 156 Consequently, African Americans formed their own media, the black press. Over royalties. Little Richard sold the rights to the song, Tutti Frutti, for a reported $1.50, and received half a cent for each record sold. I was a dumb black kid and my mama had 12 kids and my daddy was dead, Little Richard reportedly said. I wanted to help them, so I took whatever was offered. 1984. Office of War Information, a government censorship agency, blocked racial depictions of discrimination against non-white people to show a falsely ideal racial democracy. The Office of War Information also approved blackface and jokes perpetuating and relying upon black stereotypes. Journal was one of the first of many subsequent black newspapers and publications that would be formed throughout the United States. 157 These publications advocated for community cohesiveness, demonstrated racial pride, and challenged legislation. 158 The staff members of small black publications often risked their lives to refute white supremacy in the news. 159 Ida B. Wells was a journalist for the Memphis Weekly known as the Free Speech. 160 She conducted investigations. Mobs regularly lynched innocent victims as part of a racial terror regime. 161 This was work that should have been done by federal and state law enforcement agencies. She found that the black men who were charged with raping white women were often involved in consensual relationships with them. 162 After she published findings in an editorial, a white mob destroyed the free speech, suffering no legal consequences. 163 Black newspapers like the Baltimore Afro-American, the Chicago Defender, and the Pittsburgh Courier served as a corrective to the lies of the white press, and advanced the early civil rights movement. 164 Americans were often invisible in white press and mainstream media, unless they were alleged to have committed crimes. 165 They were often denied courtesy titles such as Mrs. and Mr., which were given to white Americans. 166 When African Americans were cast in television shows, acted out narratives crafted by white Americans that pigeonholed them in roles as domestics, criminals, brutes, or lazy and deceitful. 167 In 1945, H. Johnson established Ebony Magazine, one of the first magazines to be founded by and operated for African Americans. 168 Ebony highlighted historical figures who had been left out of textbooks. 169 The magazine also worked with corporations who sought to advertise to African American communities. 170 In 1979. Johnson, no relation to John H. Johnson, a cable industry lobbyist, called Black Entertainment Television Bet. 171 By the 1990s, he sold Bet to Viacom for $2.3 billion, making him the first African-American billionaire in U.S. history. 172. Television has a sordid history of creating television's house and serious that reinforce racism against African Americans and are written, conceived, and produced by Americans. 173 White Hollywood has been complicit in the racist practices that thwarted black freedom struggles. 174 The first black sitcom originated from a radio program called Amos and Andy in the 1940s. Two white men portrayed black characters. 175 According to testimony by Dr. Darnell Hunt before the California Task Force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans, crime procedurals were found to routinely glamorize policing and to legitimize the criminal justice system. Playing the degree to which African Americans are racially profiled and victimized by both. This finding is particularly alarming given what we know about the normalizing effects of media, about the potential for media, in this case, to condition police officers, prosecutors, juries, judges, vigilantes to perceive black bodies as a threat, and police violence against them as justified. 176 This is important because, as Erica Alexander stated in her testimony, Tory is the conduit to our mind, but once the seed is planted, it is the quickest way to our heart. 177. Television industry was almost entirely white for many of its initial decades. 178 Black writers and actors in the 1970s faced exclusion at nearly every turn. 179 Television executives held the racist presumption that white writers could write for any audience. Black writers only could contribute to black shows. 180 The black screenwriters who are employed by mainstream television networks are often tasked with crafting stereotypical narratives of black people and storylines that are acceptable to white producers, studio executives. 181 In 2005, the gap in median annual salary between white and black writers in the television industry was nearly $15,000. 182 According to a 2017 survey of the television industry, 1% of shows are led by white creators and producers. 183 Only 13% of U.S. full-power commercial TV stations were black-owned in 2019. 184 African Americans are largely underrepresented. Entertainment industry. 185 While they comprise 12.4% of the general population in 2020, African Americans only constituted 39% of major studio heads, 68% of network CEOs. 186 They comprised 4.5% of broadcast show creators. 4% of digital show creators for the 2019-2020 season. 187 Federal and state governments have neglected to address the anti-black discrimination in the entertainment industry. Wells was a journalist for the Memphis Weekly known as the Free Speech. She conducted investigations, finding that mobs regularly lynched innocent victims as part of a racial terror regime. Work that should have been done by federal and state law enforcement agencies. She found that the black men who were charged with raping white women were often involved in consensual relationships with them. After she published her findings in an editorial, a white mob destroyed the Free Speech, suffering no legal consequences. 306. Chapter 9. Over creative, cultural, and intellectual life. Practices of radio advertisers in the U.S. have been characterized by the Federal Communications Commission (FCC) as racially discriminatory. Minority broadcasting stations earn 63% less than other stations with comparable market shares. 188 Despite this, FCC has failed to enact regulations to protect black radio stations and media businesses. 189 of the 11,000 commercial radio stations across the country, 180 are owned by African Americans, about 16% of the total 190. Carol Cutting is a black radio station owner who started a jazz station in 1999 in Springfield, where there were no black-owned radio stations. 191 She went through a 15-year legal battle to be able to finally get her broadcast license and is the only African American to own a commercial radio station, AM or FM, in New England. 192. 2020, the National Association of Black-Owned Broadcasters called on Congress to pass a bill that would reinstate a tax incentive to encourage people to sell radio stations to members of minority communities and women. 193 The legislation would bring back a tax break enacted in 1978 to account for the history in broadcast licensing. 194 In the years it was in effect, minority ownership increased, however, in 1995. Incentive was overturned by Congress. 195 African Americans have proposed that the FCC approve a new technology called radio geotargeting that would allow radio stations to provide geographic-specific traffic, weather, public interest information, advertising to their local communities. 196 Geotargeting would allow black radio stations to better engage listeners, allow for more black ownership, and more effectively reach African American communities. 197 As of September 2021, the proposal was pending FCC approval. 198 Consequently, the federal government has engaged in discriminatory regulation of the media, which has harmed black media professionals and business owners. Women face excessive racism and discrimination on social media today. In 2018, Amnesty International and Element AI found that black women on Twitter were 84% more likely than white women to receive hateful tweets. 199 Despite this harassment, black women online are innovators who contribute greatly to digital spaces. 200 black activists say that their remarks on racism are disproportionately stifled on Facebook. 201 California 50s, blackface minstrelsy dominated entertainment in San Francisco. 202 minstrel songs were played during a banquet for the new University of California president in 1899. 203 California has been home to racist monument and memorial construction for centuries. The Native Sons of the Golden West is a California organization that has erected racist monuments throughout the state. 204 It was formed on July 11, 1865 with the goal of honoring the 49ers. White people to settle in California and take advantage of the gold rush and has erected monuments through the state. 205 In the 1920s, the Native Sons of the Golden West Grand President wrote that California was given by God to a white people. God's strength, we want to keep it as He gave it to us. 206 The United Daughters of the Confederacy had 14 chapters across California. 207 And erected plaques, monuments, and other memorials dedicated to Confederate generals and soldiers across California, such as in Monterey and San Diego. Throughout the 1940s and 1950. 208 California has erected a great number of Confederate monuments. A dozen or more state markers and cemetery memorials. 209 Some of these monuments were erected by Southern veterans of the Confederacy who moved to Southern California after the Civil War and sought to memorialize their service through the creation of monuments. 210 The Mendocino coastal town of Fort is named after a Confederate Army general. Flavor, as of March 2021, the town has not yet changed its names despite numerous requests. 211 Workers cover a Confederate monument at Santa Ana Cemetery after it was defaced with orange paint. The monument honored Confederate soldiers who fought for the Confederate States of America during the Civil War. 2019 Radio, film, and television industries. California has neglected to adequately address widespread discrimination. Out of the hundreds of radio stations in California, only 2 are black-owned. 212 the state of California has, overall. To enforce the civil rights of black people or address the widespread practice of anti-black discrimination in Hollywood. 213 African Americans have been depicted in crude stereotypical film roles in Hollywood, as servants, rapists, people, or they were barred from roles in films altogether. 214. Times apologized for being an institution deeply rooted in white supremacy for most of its history and admitted to a record that included indifference and outright hostility toward the city's non-white population, acknowledging the underrepresentation of black journalists in the newsroom. 215 for The Times won a Pulitzer Prize for its coverage of the August 1965 civil unrest in Watts. While much of the Watts story's content was reported by a 24-year-old black advertising messenger, Robert Richardson, the reporters and editors of record were nearly all white. 216 Richardson covered the disturbances, arriving to the scene and phoning in his reports. 217 He was designated a reporter trainee after the uprisings but was only provided minimal mentorship or opportunities to enhance his skills. He left the paper the following year. 218 Contrast, California's black newspapers hired black reporters and writers and invested in them from 1850 to 1870. The earliest black newspapers published in California included the Mirror of the Times, the Pacific Appeal, and the Elevator. 219 These newspapers emphasized civil rights, community politics. 220 Writers and editors were free to be activists and journalists. 221 The California Eagle was founded in 1879 and helped ease African Americans' transition to the West, providing them with housing and job information. Other information essential to surviving in a new environment. 222 With Charlotta Spears' base at the helm, over the years, the Eagle protested racism in the motion picture industry, in the military, successfully waged battles against discriminatory hiring in Los Angeles, work that should have been done by the state government. 223 The state government has failed to prevent discrimination in mainstream media in California. Social Media Transparency and Accountability Act of 2021, Assembly Bill 587, would require social media platforms to publicly disclose their corporate policies regarding online hate, disinformation, extremism, harassment, and foreign interference, as well as key metrics and data regarding the enforcement of those policies. 224 However, the bill only applies to social media companies that have at least $100 million in revenue, which would exclude many websites where racist commentary and discourse is highly prevalent. Parler. 225 As a result, California's attempts to address white supremacy and racism targeted at African Americans online may still leave many vulnerable to abuse. In conclusion, the state of California has promoted blackface minstrelsy, funded Confederate monuments, to enforce the civil rights of African American artists, culture makers, and media makers.